actually did try and publish about that and call him to account.
Okay, hello, I am Professor Trina Jones, and welcome to the second of a three-part series of conversations about race in the United States. Amos Mills, who is an alumnus of Duke Law School, is responsible for this series. It's named after his mother and his sister, who were both wonderful women who were committed to public service and social justice. Today, we are delighted to have Professor Juan Perea with us to lead a conversation about the implications of the changing demographics in the United States. Professor Perea is an amazing scholar of race relations. I've read his work for years and have always admired it. He joined the University of Florida Levin School of Law in 1990, where he holds a chaired professorship. He teaches civil procedure, con law, employment law, and race relations. And he has authored numerous articles, including one of my favorites, which is the black-white dichotomy, or the black-white binary paradigm of race, as well as a number of top-notch books, including Immigrants Out, The New Nativism and the Anti-Immigrant Impulse in the United States. He's the author of a forthcoming casebook on Latinos and the law, and he is also a co-author of one of my favorite resources when I think about race relations in the United States, and that's a casebook on race and races. So we're delighted to have Professor Perea with us today. I should warn you, before we even begin, that this is supposed to be a conversation series and not a lecture series. So Professor Perea has some comments that he has prepared to initiate the dialogue, but what we hope will happen afterwards is that you will engage him as well as each other during the more open part of the event. So without further ado, Professor Perea.
Thank you so much. Trina, thank you so much for your invitation to be here with you today, and for that very kind introduction, and for putting in a plug for my forthcoming book, which I didn't know you knew about, but I'm delighted you mentioned it. It's Latinos and the Law, and it'll be available this summer for fall adoptions at fine bookstores everywhere. Thank you all for coming. I'm really delighted to have this opportunity to be here with you, and it's funny, karma is a funny thing because race has been in the news a lot in recent weeks, and this week Barack Obama gave his speech on race. So what I decided to do was to, in many ways, to integrate some of my work, but to organize it around some of the propositions in Barack Obama's speech, and to talk a little bit about those issues, and then see where we go from there. So I have some observations about his speech. What I'm going to do is to talk first about how race seems to have been used in our public discourse surrounding the speech that Obama gave, and just a few thoughts on that. Then discuss some assertions that Obama made about the meaning of the Constitution. And then lastly, talk about some of his observations about basically how the views of African Americans need to be taken seriously, how the views of whites need to be taken seriously. But what was missing there was any real engagement with the views of Latinos and Latinas. And at this point in our demographics, Latinos are the largest minority group. I'm sure you've all read that. And so I want to give you some tentative thoughts about some things that might be said about concerns that Latinos and blacks and whites might have about each other if we introduce Latinos into the mix. So that's the basic structure of what I'd like to say, and I trust that we'll have a lot to talk about when I'm done. I thought Obama's speech was terrific. Now, I'm a big fan of his, so discount that as you need to. But I really liked the speech because he spoke some truths and recited some evidence that's rarely, if ever, discussed so publicly. Now, I think that the truths and the evidence that he talked about are very well known in the African American community and for those of us who study race as well. So there wasn't much new in what he said, I think, but the great significance of it was its public utterance, the fact that he made a speech about our racial history, about different people's feelings about race. He gave both black and white points of view and the basis for both black and white anger with respect to race relations today, and this was new and different for a public figure, and I think he deserves a lot of credit for having done that. I don't know if you reacted this way, but it seemed to me that after his speech, there was kind of a palpable national sigh of relief that it was possible for someone in the national arena to actually say something constructive about race. And I think that's both a credit to Obama's understanding and his, I mean, he's a brilliant man and has shown that time and time again. Another take on that, though, is the remarkably impoverished extent of any public debate about race. I mean, what certain historians were saying was that this was the first speech since Johnson or since Kennedy, and referring back to Abraham Lincoln. And that may well be true. That it may well be that this is one of the first and most prominent speeches about race in 40 or 50 years. But if that's so, then our national discourse on race is remarkably poor, remarkably impoverished. And no wonder we're at a standstill, because the issues have always been pressing, and if nobody's talking about them except once every 50 years or so, then no wonder there's so much stress and tension and anger and misunderstanding and segregation. So I give him all the credit in the world, but I think we really need a lot more of same, and hopefully our leadership of the future can help provide direction and structure for that kind of conversation. First, a couple of remarks about the binary conception of race, which I think has been re-articulated quite a bit in the course of dealing with Obama's speech. The basic idea is that we understand race principally, sometimes exclusively, in terms of relationships between blacks and whites. Now, if you think about it, obviously that's under-inclusive. Yet our discourse, time and time again, really is limited in that way, and I think that limits the ways that we understand race. That was the idea in the article that Professor Jones mentioned. And so these are just a few observations, and they're just my observations of what I've observed on TV and in the media. First, that the word race is strongly associated only with Obama, obviously a black man, but that the quality of race or of having a race is attributed only or predominantly to the black man who happens to be on the stage. Everybody has a race, but we don't talk about that, okay? Following on that point, and this is a development of it, is really, to me, I hadn't thought about this, but I'll just express this, the remarkable normativity of whiteness and maleness as an aspect of the presidency. I mean, I would take a different look at this and say that race and gender have always been issues in our presidential elections. And if we look at the record, every single American president and vice president has been a white male. Now, that's a pretty remarkable statistic after 200-some years of nationhood. It's, you know, whiteness and maleness has virtually been an unstated qualification for high office and for the presidency. And it's, to me, it's remarkable that so many, I think, lack an awareness that that in itself is a racial issue. We take it so for granted that we don't think of that as a racial issue, but I think it is. It's as much a racial issue as Barack Obama being a black candidate now. But we don't think about it that way. And it really is a very powerful normative standard, and it has a lot of unconscious power in how we think about these things. A final comment on the debate about Obama's speech is that it seemed to me, and you may have seen other commentators, I mean, I watched as much as I could, but, you know, with cable it's overwhelming. Basically, there were solely black or white commentators expressing opinions on the speech, at least insofar as I could tell. Well, why were there no Latino commentators or Asian commentators on the race questions? Why missing in action? Especially, I wouldn't say especially Latinos, but maybe most surprisingly, I mean, Latinos are the largest minority group in the country right now. Why no commentary from any Latino or Latina? Except Maria Echaveste, but I think she was there because she's high up in Hillary Clinton's campaign. As far as I know, she was the only Latina that I saw. And maybe if you saw others, you can educate me about that. Anyway, again, so there's been a binary conception of race, I think, that's informed and influenced what we've seen in the wake of and also leading to Barack Obama's speech. And I just want to point that out. Okay, so here's a little section on Obama's speech and the Constitution. What I'm going to do is quote a section of his speech and then go over some provisions of the Constitution. This may be familiar for some of you, but it may not be. I don't know. So I guess I'll do it as quickly as I can to spare you boredom if it's boring for you, but I think it's important. Here's my quote from Obama's speech. And he's referring now to the Constitution produced at the Constitutional Convention. I quote here, "The document they produced was eventually signed but ultimately unfinished. It was stained by this nation's original sin of slavery, a question that divided the colonies and brought the convention to a stalemate until the founders chose to allow the slave trade to continue for at least 20 more years and to leave any final resolution to future generations. Of course, the answer to the slavery question was already embedded within our Constitution, a Constitution that had at its very core the ideal of equal citizenship under the law, a Constitution that promised its people liberty and justice and a union that could be and should be perfected over time." Okay, so that's the quote from Obama's speech. And now here's what he was referring to in the Constitution. And thank goodness that this works much better than overhead projectors. Now, what I'm going to do is go over some of the main provisions in the Constitution that actively protected slavery. And for me, it's very possible, and I understand the original Constitution as a pro-slavery document. Here's why. You're probably all familiar with the wording here, 3/5 of all other persons, as a reference to slave property in the South. Slaves were to be counted as 3/5 of all other purposes for the purpose of inflating Southern representation in Congress, but not for the purpose of giving black slaves any voting rights or anything like that. This was just to increase Southern representation. And this ended up being a very powerful clause because it was for this reason that so many Southern presidents, so many of our early presidents were from the South and slave owners. So Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Andrew Jackson, a lot of that is the operation of the increased representation in the South because of that provision. Okay, so that's number one. focus is good. You all know the Commerce Clause, right? Maybe not if you're not a law student, but Clause 3 here is the Commerce Clause. Okay. Now, interestingly, in Section 9 of Article 1 is the one restriction that the framers put into the Constitution with respect to the commerce power. And it was a restriction that prohibited Congress from regulating the slave trade for 20 years. Now, in fact, the slave trade went on way past 1808, but it's striking that if you think back to your con law courses, Justice Marshall described the commerce power as a plenary power. Congress can do whatever it thinks necessary using its plenary powers, as long as the end is reasonable and the means reasonable. Let the ends be reasonable and the means be calculated to fit the ends, then it'll be constitutional. I think I'm paraphrasing from McCulloch v. Maryland. Despite that plenary power, here's the one restriction that the framers put on the exercise of that plenary power. So this is a very striking provision, too, and it's quite an important protection for the slave trade. Okay. Oh, rats. Okay, well, it's good to get that over with, you know. And in the realm of possible things going wrong, that's kind of a small one. I don't have any napkins up here. I'd clean up after myself, but we'll deal with that. Okay. Now, here's another protection for the slave trade and for slavery itself. This is the Fugitive Slave Clause, which requires anyone encountering an escaped slave to return the slave to its original owner. And eventually, this was enforced through federal legislation, even though there's no federal power to enact legislation under this clause. So Congress, in Trigg v. Pennsylvania, the Supreme Court was willing to imply power of Congress to make fugitive slave legislation to enforce this. So protection for escaped slaves and for slave ownership. Now, Article 5 here, and this is it's the last protection for slavery that I'm going to talk about. Article 5 is the part of the Constitution that allows for constitutional amendments. Okay, so the framers understood that the Constitution was going to be changed at some point, or might need to be changed, and they gave us Article 5 for that purpose. But take a look at the last clause in Article 5. And yeah, that's I've scared you, huh? With yeah. I wish I could say that was an unusual event, but it's not. So that's wise. Thank you, Trina. That's good. Okay. Back to my point here. Look at this in the amendment clause of the Constitution, Article 5. Provided that no amendment which may be made prior to the year 1808 shall in any manner affect first, the first clause of the 9th section of the first article, which was that limitation on federal legislation to limit the slave trade. So not only did they prohibit in Article 1 Congress from passing legislation to limit the slave trade, they prohibited amendment of the Constitution for the purpose of changing that. So this is astonishing. They disabled themselves from making a change to the Constitution that would alter the slave trade. That to me is astonishing. Okay, so, and there are other provisions too that a little more indirectly support the slave trade, but perhaps enough said. So I would take the position that the original Constitution was a pro-slavery document, and that leads me to take issue with the second part of what Obama says in this quote that I read to you. I'll reread it. he writes, of course, the answer to the slavery question was already embedded within our Constitution, a Constitution that had at its very core the ideal of equal citizenship under the law, a Constitution that promised its people liberty and justice and a union that could be and should be perfected over time. Well, I don't think so. I don't think so. I think his rhetoric is really good, but I think it's very, very hard to make the case that the answer to the slavery question was already embedded within our Constitution, and that the Constitution had at its core any principle of equal citizenship. In fact, quite the opposite. It built in all kinds of inequality. We don't even begin to get equal citizenship until the Reconstruction Amendments. And here's Amendment 14. Most of you will be familiar with this. In the Equal Protection Clause here, this is the first time that the word equality, or equal protection, it's the first time any notion of equality is introduced into the Constitution. And then, of course, and this with respect to racial equality. Of course, we don't get gender equality, sexual equality, until the 19th Amendment in 1920. So I would take the position, and I do take the position, that basically the Constitution that we celebrate today is probably more, I would say is definitely more, a function of Reconstruction than of the original document. In what ways? Well, the post-Reconstruction Constitution promises equal protection. It introduces that ideal of equality and a standard of equality into our fundamental law. That just wasn't there before. Now, if you read the history of the enactment of the 14th Amendment, its framers, its proponents, really wanted to make the Bill of Rights applicable to everybody. And although the Supreme Court has never adopted total incorporation, it was the 14th Amendment, through its Due Process Clause, I don't need to put it up, through its Due Process Clause, it makes the Bill of Rights applicable to the states. So what we understand as constitutional protections like the Bill of Rights, the First Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, now the Second Amendment that's being debated in the Supreme Court, this was all made applicable to the states through the 14th Amendment. And I think that's what we think of as the Constitution, is the fact that we have certain rights that are enforceable against our states. But that wasn't true before 1868 at all. The whole notion of fundamental rights as well. That was developed through creative interpretations of the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. So what we think of as our rights and our sense of what it means to be a citizen of this country and a citizen protected by the Constitution, I think almost all of this comes after 1868. So I would argue that we celebrate the wrong framers. We ought to be celebrating John Bingham, the principal author of the 14th Amendment, and Thaddeus Stevens, and Charles Sumner. We should be celebrating the triumph of abolitionism and the introduction of anti-slavery and equality into our fundamental law. This is important. It's important for several reasons. It proves that real change is possible, that the kind of change Obama's talking about really is possible. But it's only possible if we know our own agency in making or forcing that change. And if we sort of genuflect before the original Constitution and assume that all good things flowed from that document, then we're less apt to understand that it takes our power to make the document responsive and more egalitarian, more equal, better, more perfectible. And we have an incentive to care about who's on the court that's interpreting this document, which I'm often astounded at how small an issue that is for most people, even law students. But it's huge. Our rights depend on those folks, and also on what the document says. So certainly, the Reconstruction Amendments support Obama's view of the perfectibility of the Constitution, but most of us would agree it still needs work. Okay, now how am I doing time-wise? I have a few more minutes. Okay, well, I tried to be brief, and I did have an unplanned spill. So let me talk about cross-racial tensions quickly. And this is as brief as I can make it, Trina. I'm sorry, but you did ask me to address a lot of stuff. So with apologies to you all, I really do want us to discuss these things, but let me just toss this out. Okay, so I'm going to quote again from Obama's speech and then make some comments on it. And these are parts of the speech where he's talking about what the African-American community needs to do to pursue a path of a more perfect union, and also what the white community has to do to pursue the path of a more perfect union. So here I quote from Obama's speech. For the African-American community, that path of a more perfect union, means embracing the burdens of our past without becoming victims of our past. It means continuing to insist on a full measure of justice in every aspect of American life. But it also means binding our particular grievances for better health care, better schools, better jobs, to the larger aspirations of all Americans. The white woman struggling to break the glass ceiling, the white man who's been laid off, the immigrant trying to feed his family. Then he gives a similarly structured peroration to the white community. In the white community, the path to a more perfect union means acknowledging that what ails the African-American community does not just exist in the minds of black people, that the legacy of discrimination and current incidents of discrimination, while less overt than in the past, are real and must be addressed. I'm going to skip a sentence here, and I continue with the quote. It requires all Americans to realize that your dreams do not have to come at the expense of my dreams, that investing in the health, welfare, and education of black and brown and white children will ultimately help all of America prosper. And to that I would say, right on. That's beautiful, and that's exactly right. I mean, he's exactly right. Terrific. And it's wonderful that he conveys understanding in his comments that it's not enough to care only about the welfare of our own group. One must also care about the welfare of members of other groups as well, our fellow citizens, our kindred spirits. Our kind needs to be a bigger concept than we usually think of it. Why? Because all it takes is indifference towards the welfare of other groups to lock in the present effects of both past and present discrimination. All it takes is not to care. That's all it takes, and nothing changes. So right on to Barack for those comments. But, you know, I'm a critic, so consider also what's missing, okay? There's no comment on what Latinos must come to understand about blacks and whites, nor on what blacks or whites must understand about Latinos to progress on this path of a more perfect union. I mean, we're all here, including Latinos and Latinas, you know, so hopefully we all want to be on this path. So again, essentially we're getting a binary understanding of racial dynamics, although I wouldn't fault Obama much, given his priorities in the speech. I mean, he had a lot of work that he needed to do in the speech, a lot of it determined by outside forces, dealing with Reverend Wright, etc. However, how realistic is it to begin to mark a path towards the healing of racial divides without considering the needs and responsibilities of the nation's largest minority group? I'll offer some tentative thoughts, and these really are very tentative, about issues that become salient when Latinos are introduced into the mix. We know what happens when they're not introduced into the mix, because that's kind of what always happens. Okay. I don't intend in these remarks at all to essentialize points of view or suggest that these are fixed or universal or comprehensive, okay? These are just based on, you know, within my limited awareness and understanding, what I've learned and some things that maybe we need to think about and that we can certainly talk about when I'm done. And don't worry, I don't have much more, okay? Okay, with respect to tensions between blacks and Latinos, it seems to me that there's much mistrust in the black community with respect to Latinos, and often this mistrust is well-founded. There are different reasons for it. I think, at least in part, fair-skinned Latinos often identify as white, and this leads to a real mistrust and confusion about whether Latinos can be reliable partners in coalition. There are concerns often expressed that they're taking our jobs. The illegal immigrants are taking jobs that should be held by African Americans. And I guess I would respond to that just by saying that that's a real concern. That's a real concern, but I'm not sure that it's undocumented immigrants who are responsible for producing that situation. And if you ask me, I'll give you a historical example of a theme that might help us understand that. But the bottom line with that point is that corporate America, business owners, are deciding to whom to offer jobs and the reasons for doing that. They're also regularly breaking the Fair Labor Standards Act and undermining labor standards for everyone in deciding to hire undocumented people. And so with respect to any job, I think primary responsibility really should be laid with entities that are willing to hire at substandard rates and just out of greed, basically. Okay, another concern that I think is a tension between blacks and Latinos. Concerns that Latinos are foreign recent arrivals whose needs shouldn't be met until the black community's needs are met. And I guess I would say that it's very understandable that given the amount of indifference encountered with respect to meeting the needs of the black community, that's really quite an understandable response. On the other hand, I can demonstrate to you, given a little time, that Latinos are not really a foreign population. Mexican Americans were created by the U.S. when the U.S. conquered Mexico and took the part that it thought was desirable. The U.S. produced Mexican Americans. The U.S. produced Puerto Ricans and New Yorkers by conquering Puerto Rico and then keeping Puerto Rico legally outside the Constitution. And it's complex, but Latinos are not foreign on these shores. Yes, there are a lot of undocumented immigrants and laborers now, but much more than half of the population is a resident, citizen, or legal population. So we're not foreigners. Other issues, concerns that Latinos have not earned civil rights and don't deserve them. That's something we need to talk about. Tell you what I was going to do is to sort of give question and answer with respect to each of these. What I'll do is I'll just go through things, and whatever interests you to ask me about, we can talk about it in discussion, because that will save some time, okay? And I've gone on way too long. My apologies here. Okay. The idea that Latinos will progress under the immigrant paradigm and are not subject to real racism. The concern that Latino progress means less for blacks. Okay, here are some tensions between whites and Latinos. Concern about demographic change. I think there's a lot of fear of America appearing more brown. There's also a concern about cultural change, often labeled deterioration in American culture, the presence of Spanish and Spanglish and bilingual education, etc. There's a predominant image of Latinos as undocumented immigrants and foreigners, which, as I've suggested to you, this is historically false. Latinos do present a challenge to a mono or bichromatic view of who's a real American. Who exactly is that reasonable person? What race is a reasonable person in tort law? Just think about what comes to mind. And you'll see how normative whiteness is, I think. The white-controlled media, I think, sees only possibilities of black and brown conflict. I don't know if you've noticed this, but every time there's a story about blacks and Latinos, it's always presented as though the groups are necessarily in opposition to each other. Always. And that influences people's views. If we accept that, then we're going to assume conflict. If we ignore that, then we might be able to get beyond that and consider possibilities of coalition. And I just want to go quickly. Let me just, Latinos certainly have some needs for civil rights and recognition of legitimacy. But I would say that what Latinos need to recognize and to work on are to recognize the needs of other communities. For example, considering seriously how immigration hurts African Americans and working class and poor whites. I think Latinos need to interrogate and resist their own racism and the extent to which assimilation implies the adoption of racism against African Americans. Lastly, some elements of a possible common agenda, many of which were mentioned in Obama's speech. The quality of public education, the tragically high degree of imprisonment of both African American and Latino males, and increasingly females, the substandard quality of housing, the substandard quality of available employments. So I would just underline the remarkable importance of reaching across the constructed borders of racial identity to understand and appreciate and ameliorate the concerns of groups different from one's own. And I would congratulate Obama for beginning that process. Okay.
All right, thank you.
I'm sorry I took too long.
So I had a number of questions that I wanted to put to you, but I think that I will open it up to whatever's of interest to those of you in the audience. Yes, Aisha.
I have a question.
Yes.
I wanted to know, in response to your first concern
Yes.
about mistrust between the Black community and the Latino community, and then about how it's portrayed in the media, to what extent do you think that that's regional? And the reason I ask is because I am Black and Latino, and when I growing up in the tri-state area, there is a huge influx. And, you know, my family's Caribbean. There's a huge influx of Black. Of Black migrants, of people coming to this country, and there was, I mean, in growing up, there was never a sense like, you know, Puerto Ricans, Cubans, whatever. In New York, it's a community together. Blacks, it's a community. My parents moved to Texas, you know, it was a whole nother ballgame. So, you know, I'd never met a Latino person who identified as white, and then I did. So, to what extent do you feel like that's a regional phenomenon?
Well, one of the interesting things is that it can be a regional phenomenon. But I don't think that media discourse, at least at the national level, I'm defining it at a high level of generality, at the national level, there isn't much subtlety in it. And I think there isn't, it's just striking. I don't know, have others of you noticed it, that black, it's always black versus brown. I think that's the title of one such article written some years ago. But that's always the way it's portrayed. And I would say regionally, sure, there are going to be some regional differences, but we're constantly taught and presented as being in conflict with each other. And I wonder what the other possibilities are. But there's certainly a regional aspect in terms of contact with each other. The other thing I would say is that a lot of, there's kind of, New England has a stranglehold on basically on people in positions of influence in academia and in the media. And the New England experience of race is very, very different from other parts of the country. And it's really, really striking. If you look at the literature on race, most of it's written by people who were educated at Harvard and Yale and Princeton and, you know, great universities, but in places that have a very particular racial dynamic going on. And the only person, Bob Blauner at UC Berkeley, as of the 1990s, was the only sociologist who had described the condition of Chicanos and had described this phenomenon of Latino invisibility. Now, he wrote that in the 1970s, but it was just as true in 1997 when I studied a lot of the major literature on race. And so you need to look, I mean, much of what we understand as race is our lived experience. So there could be much more nuance in our racial debates if the sources of people reporting and the sources of people writing about it had very different lived experiences. And clearly there's a regional quality to it.
Just to follow up on Aisha's question,
yes.
just for a second, because it's supposed to be more interactive.
Oh, okay.
No.
Where do you want me?
That's not a criticism of you at all. I want you beside me.
Yeah, okay.
And that is, what does it mean to be Latina or Latino? Is that a racial identity? Because you said several times during your talk that Latinos would be the largest minority group in the United States, but there are Black Latinos,
yes,
right?
Absolutely.
As well as whites. And Orlando Patterson, I think a couple of years ago in the New York Times, made this point that there's all this hysteria about the United States becoming increasingly brown and Black, but yet that ignores the fact that there is a large number of white Latinos who will identify as being white. And so perhaps that's not an accurate statement of what's likely to happen and what's happening in states like Texas and California and so on and so forth. So I guess the question is, what is being Latina or Latino, right? Is that a racial categorization? Is it an ethnic identity? How do we conceptualize this concept?
Yeah, okay. Well, you've asked me a hard question. I mean, I'd like to take it under advisement, but I can't. Actually, I will. I will. I will take it under advisement, but I'll also attempt to answer it. Latinos really kind of, and I think it's constructive in some ways, confuse our usual notions of race, okay? I mean, I'm a fair-skinned white guy until somebody knows my name, and then I'm perceived very differently, and I'm treated differently. Once people know my name, I'm treated very differently. That might surprise you, but I am, and I know I am, and I know that's not a unique thing. I take the position that Latinos are a race, okay? Why do I do that? I do that because Latinos are subject to racism. And I think one of the dynamics of race is that it's both self-identification, but it's also how society constructs you from the outside. So I know that even fair-skinned Latinos are subject to racism or something like racism. And so that to me means Latinos are a race because we are subject to racism. And even though we have lots of hues, you know, that's, you know, there's a whole range of skin colors in the African American community too, and in the white community. Maybe in the Latino community, it's a broader range. It's not defined quite as much by skin color, but certainly because Latinos are subject to racism, I consider us a race. And that's, yes?
What types of racism have you specifically experienced in your life?
Okay, oh geez. Beginning when? Well, actually, I'll start when I was a kid. I used to be beaten up. Spanish was my first language. I was beaten up regularly because I either didn't speak English well or spoke with a pronounced accent. If you wonder where did my accent go, it was a survival strategy. There has never been, and I say this with little exaggeration, and it's a little painful to say it, there has never been a time in my life when I wasn't first identified as a Hispanic or Latino rather than by anything I've ever done or accomplished. That has never happened for me, anywhere. in my mid to late 20s, received a promotion. I was working at the Federal Reserve. I received a promotion. My first day on the job, I walked down the aisle with my suit and my briefcase. Somebody I had never seen before came up to me and said, you know, I don't like Hispanics, but at least I'm open about it. First day. And without saying hello. And the thing was, he was right. That place, they hated my guts. And it didn't have to do with how I did the job. I was Hispanic. I was whatever they thought of as Hispanic. But, you know, I wish, God, I wish it had stopped at some point, but it never has. In law school hiring circles, I had a member of a hiring committee one time tell me I'm not the right kind of Hispanic. Okay? Now, what does that mean? It means I'm not Chicano. I'm not. I'm other Hispanic because my parents are from Colombia and Costa Rica. It made no difference that the students that I reach, whose story I identify with the most closely and who I maybe reach the best, at least who seem most moved by what I have to say sometimes, are Chicano students and Puerto Rican students. But I'm not the right kind of Hispanic, okay? And Matt, translate the skin color or translate the race and think about whether that would be an acceptable comment. Someone's not the right kind of black. Someone's not the right kind of white. Now, this was somebody on a law school hiring committee who, number one, that violates Title VII. It's offensive as hell. Violates Title VII right off the bat. And, you know, it goes on and on. Another example is people discount the legitimacy of what I write because I write about minority issues and because I have my name. So that's a short summary, but it's never stopped, and it's never been different from that. Yes, Mr. Mills. Yeah.
Well, other countries have had truth and reconciliation commissions like South
Yes, yes,
Africa.
yes.
Even doing it in Liberia. Why hasn't America had a truth and reconciliation commission? Someone once told me that race is like a big elephant in a lake. Everybody sees it, knows it's there, but refuses to act as though to acknowledge that it's there. The second quick question I'd like to ask you: do you think that Senator Obama is being held to a different standard by concentrating on his relationship with his former minister, Mr. Wright, as opposed to them holding people like Thomas Jefferson, who was supposed to have been for the Declaration of Independence and Freedom, but had a relationship with a woman of color for over 20 years and was a slave owner, or Hillary Clinton herself, whose husband had all the affairs, and is he being held to a different standard than other people are?
Okay, these are two great questions. On the first one, I'm so glad you asked me that. I gave a talk earlier this year titled Why We Need a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Okay, so I'm happy that we're on a similar wavelength with respect to that. I think we need one desperately. Why haven't we had it? Because we're in denial. As a nation, we are in denial. Our leaders are in complete denial about our history, about the current effects of our history, and it would tell such a different story about the United States than the story that people want to believe about the United States that I think that would be it would be a very difficult exercise. It always is. But I think it's profoundly necessary. And in some way or another, I hope that that can happen. With respect to Jefferson, you know, it's funny because, and this goes to some of what I was saying before, people knew about his relationship with Sally Hemings. He denied it. There was a journalist named Samuel Callender who first published reports in 1802, I think, about Sally Hemings and Jefferson's kids who were enslaved, but who looked an awful lot like Jefferson, and wondering what that was about. And Jefferson threw Callender in jail. Why could he do that? Because the First Amendment didn't apply to state government. Why was that the case? Because the original Bill of Rights only restricted the federal government with respect to the citizen, not the state. And that's one of the huge changes that emerges from Reconstruction, as I mentioned. Now, today, I mean, Wolf Blitzer would be on the case, right? And John Anderson and who else? Anderson Cooper, yes, not John. John Anderson is the lead singer for Yes. My apologies. I meant Anderson Cooper. Yes, that's right. But you know they'd be on it. Now, will Barack be held to a... I'm very glad you asked me that. I think so. I think what will happen is that the Reverend Right is going to keep being brought up to scare white people. I think one of the very scary things in our national racial dynamics is managing black anger, if I can put it that way. I think justifiable black anger with respect to the denial of history and the indifference with which black history has been treated. And so I think my prediction would be that Obama may have dealt with it well in this speech, but the Reverend Right will still be brought up as a very scary representation of what a black person will bring to the national arena in some way. And I wish that weren't true, but it's happened so often in the past that I think this situation is almost tailor-made for that.
Do you think he's the equivalent of Bully Morton and the use of Bully Morton in, what was it, 1988?
That's what I keep thinking, that it will be used in the same way. And it will be just as unfair. I mean, it's just as unprincipled, but I wouldn't be surprised at all.
Since we're talking about politics, do you have any observations about what's happening with the Latino population in terms of voting patterns, right? Because if you look at what happened in Texas, in that southwest quadrant of Texas, Hillary Clinton seems to have done really well. And I think that there was a lot of pressure for a revote in Florida because there's the expectation that she might do better among the Latino population than Barack Obama. Do you have any thoughts about the racial dynamic that's taking place in terms of voting patterns among Latinos and Latinas? Or is that a question that's outside the scope?
Well, I wish it was outside the scope because I don't really have any insight into that except that I actually can't make any generalizations about it. I don't know. A lot of Latinos that I know are Obama supporters, and I don't, you know.
Right.
I mean, Hillary's a good candidate too, so I don't have anything to contribute to you, and I can only speak for myself.
I
so
shouldn't be jumping the queue and asking these questions, yes.
I wanted to talk a little bit more about this idea you presented about black versus brown and how you say it plays out in the media. And instinctively, I want to push back on that notion and ask your ideas about it, because it seems to me, rather, that instead what is happening is that the Hispanic community is almost being swallowed up in a discussion of minority issues, and that when people, in trying to be more inclusive, instead of saying, you know, white versus black, say white versus black and Latino. And in pop culture, it's like black and Hispanic ideas are seen as like fused together, and hip hop is black and Hispanic, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that instead, and this is, I mean, just from a personal perspective, instead it seems that the challenge then becomes disentangling oneself and establishing, you know, two distinct sets of concerns and community ideals, and maybe addressing this idea of legitimacy that you talked about. And so I guess, I don't know, I'm a little confused by this notion of black versus brown, because I feel as if there's also just as much weight in the opposite direction. And I want to know your thoughts on that.
Okay, well, okay, yeah, and thank you for your comment. One of the really interesting dynamics, I think, is that equality and racial and cultural intermingling kind of happen on the ground first, often in music. And it's really cool to witness that, because there aren't barriers there like in other parts of society. It's just not the same kind of restrictions. So that's the arts in general, much more experimentation and creativity, and hence more equality and intermingling and mixing. Now, for years, writers about race have been writing about the relationship between blacks and whites, and then as a parenthetical adding, and other people of color, or adding maybe and Latinos and Asians or something, but without paying any particular attention to what that community's needs might be. So what you may be referring to is a rhetorical inclusion that doesn't include specific attention to what the community wants or needs or can express, anything like that. So I would say the fact that and again, if I'm wrong, please correct me, but the fact that there's almost no Latino or Latina commentary on Obama's speech with respect to race tells me that we're missing in action almost completely with respect to something that has provoked a lot of discussion. And it has informed this discussion too. So I think the presence that you sense, I guess numbers and demographics and perception of presence is not the same as power and knowledge and understanding and influence. And Latinos are certainly way underrepresented in all of the latter categories. Yes?
One quick question. Could one of the problems be that there's a problem between blacks and Latinos because blacks feel that Latinos consider themselves white, and that whites have been the oppressor, and that Latinos don't want to identify with blacks, or blacks feel that they don't want to identify with blacks because Latinos don't, because negative attributes have been given to the black race, and this is a problem.
Yes.
Between the two groups.
Yes.
And blacks feel that maybe Latinos, because they're considered white, get better treatment in jobs or whatever, employment or social circles, and that blacks and then maybe Hispanics don't want to talk to or be associated with blacks because they inherit all the negative or derogatory things that are associated with blacks.
You know, sadly, that's I suspect often a dynamic or a wish, on the part of some Latinos. But let me just say that, and that was what I meant before, to repudiate racism within the Latino community and repudiate the demand to adopt racism as a condition of assimilation. Now, some people will still do that. They will want to pass as white, and that's going to happen. The irony of it is that it's impossible. Because even if you're fair-skinned, etc., I can't tell you how many times people have suggested I change my name. If only I changed my name, then I'd be okay. And including law firms and, prestigious settings. So there's some understandable reason for identifying with privilege and power, and but what a terrible price we pay when that means disparaging others with whom we probably have more in common, and when it's unattainable and it shouldn't even be necessary to try. Not in a country that promises equality and that supposedly celebrates diversity.
And I think it's worth pointing out that this is not unique to, African American, Latino relations. It also happens with other racialized groups, right? So there's the same sort of dynamic with Asian Americans and African Americans or Asian Americans, Latinos as well, where there's this desire to distance from the negative stereotypes associated with a particular group. And then the question becomes, how do you sort of tease that out to expose the commonalities, right? And the structures of power that are being entrenched right, as a result
Yes.
of this dynamic.
I mean,
right?
the tragedy is, like, take just as one example, the condition of our public schools. Do you know that Latinos have a higher dropout rate, a lower success rate in college, higher dropout rate in public school than any other minority group? Worse off than African Americans. Now, hardly anybody knows that. Why is that? Because I think there's some investment in interpreting African Americans as being the least successful in academia. That's not so. It's Latino. So it's totally against interest to not make coalition in some way to improve public education.
And it's probably
Also
important
for
to
poor
point-
whites, too. I mean, you know, where I live, and I don't sense that there's a lot of poverty around here. There may be, you know, if you drive far enough, but that was not that wasn't on the limo ride in, I didn't pick up a lot of poverty. But where I live in fairly rural Florida, in Gainesville, Florida, now Gainesville itself isn't rural, it's like a little oasis. But if you drive 5 minutes in any direction, there's migrant laborers everywhere harvesting the crops. And the poverty is grinding for white people too, and migrant workers and blacks. And why those groups can't organize in an effective way to change things that would help them all, it's not a good idea.
Next question right
Yes.
there. Your class begins at 1:30? I thought your class began at 1:20? Okay, well, we'll be out in 2 minutes. Yes, one final question.
I only have one observation. It seems to me that one of the things that Jeremiah Wright said that was credible is that the dominant group of wealthy whites can manipulate all of us in such a way that it retains their advantage and disadvantages everybody else. And so it seems to me that while we want to separate out the lunacy of some of what he said, some of the truth of what he said needs to be acknowledged. Mm-hmm. With that being said, one of the things that Barack has pointed out is this attempt to slice and dice the population as a result of determining where the political power will ultimately reside is dysfunctional because we really are such a mongrelized nation, which also nobody wants to admit, that so-called white people, if they look further into their genealogy, will probably find a connection to black people that they don't want to own, own up to. So I'm not sure that we can ever come to any good resolution of intergroup relations until we accept the notion that there is so much connection, both physiologically, genealogically, etc., that we are being manipulated for the purpose of determining how the goods and benefits of power are going to be allocated and distributed. And at the popular culture level, the reason that there isn't the same issue is because people deal with music and dance and art as those benefits to everybody. So I'm looking for a different social order, which is what I think Barack is promoting, where there is a recognition of the utility of trying to slice and dice.
Okay, with
Yeah,
that,
I would agree with you. Thank you.
thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Let me remind all of you, next